In addition to giving you access to so many different brushes for sculpting and painting, ZBrush also has a robust ability to allow you to customize your own brushes. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how we can customize a few brushes using things like gravity, cavity masking, and lazy mouse. So to begin, I have this model of a skull loaded up on my screen here, and this has been sculpted and painted inside of ZBrush. Now, if I go to the Tool menu, go to Poly Paint, I can turn the Poly Paint off and we can just see the white skull itself. So that's all just Poly Paint on there. If I want to clear the Poly Paint entirely, I can make sure the color white is selected. RGB is turned on my brush and I go to Color, Fill Object. So now Colorize turns back on, but the object is now filled with white. That previous Poly Paint is gone, but you see it's still on the teeth, which are separate subtools. So if we take the standard brush, turn off Z Add, RGB is the only thing that's turned on right now. And then we select another color. We'll make it red so it's really easy to see. And we start painting on the surface. It just covers the surface in a uniform stroke of red. Now, if we go to the stroke menu, we can change our stroke to a spray stroke. And in the spray stroke, we have a few different options down here that we can change. We're going to take color and turn color down to 0. That slider will modulate your color selection. And if we leave it or we take it down to 0, it will just stay the color we select. Now if we paint, you see we start to get this broken up pattern. I want to break this up even further though, so I'm going to go to the Alpha menu and I'm going to select Alpha 7, this broken up dot pattern. That broken up dot pattern lets me sort of spatter color onto the surface like this. So you can see this is just painting directly on the surface. It's not nuanced at all by the underlying geometry. So what we can do is if we undo those strokes, go back to our just regular white poly paint. If we go to the brush menu, tear this off by clicking the radial icon here. Most of our brush customization is going to take place in the brush menu. This is where all the settings to change our brushes live. We can also go to the stroke menu. There are other things in here that we might want to adjust to further customize the brush, but the vast majority of them are going to be here under the brush menu. So what I want to do is go to the auto masking section here, and we have the ability to mask by cavity. Now, I'm going to load up a brush that I have customized. If I go to the brush menu, go to load brush, and I bring this over here, you see I've got a variety of different custom brushes that I've made, and I have Crack Paintbrush here, and I will save this out so you can have this in the download files, and you can look at this brush yourself. Now, this brush you see has cavity masking turned on, and if we open up the cavity mask curve, you see it's way over here on the left-hand side. So what this does is it allows me to paint just inside the cracks on whatever model I have open. Now this is great if I want to paint maybe a dark brown into these areas. I can do that very easily just by using this customized brush. Now also notice the icon for this brush is custom as well. It is this skull actually with paint down in the cracks. And that's just an easy visual cue to let you see what this brush does. So I'll show you how to set this up. If we change to the standard brush, you see now if I go back to the previous brush, the paint crack brush, you see the difference there. So I'm going to go to the standard brush. I'm going to leave the broken up alpha. I'm going to fill the object with color white again to clear all of that painting that we just did just by going to color fill object while I have the color white selected. Now I'm going to turn on cavity masking. Now with cavity masking turned on, what I can do is I can adjust how the surface impacts my brush stroke. So just by its default nature, you notice that it's protecting the recessed areas. Those are not getting a masking, or those are not getting a color because they are cavity masked. Now, this curve is what's controlling that. If I flip this vertically by clicking FV, you'll notice now it paints into the recesses, but it's also getting along the So I want to narrow that effect down even more. So I will undo this, And I will narrow this curve like this. And the narrower this is, the less fall off that brush has. So you can see now it's only painting into anything that's recessed. Now, if I change my cavity mask control here, I can change the intensity. If I turn this all the way up to 100, I get this effect. If I turn this down to negative 100, you see it's painting into the recesses and leaving the high points, or excuse me, it's reversing its effect. So let's reset this. There you can see what's happening. It's painting into the recesses. If I reverse this, set it to positive 100, it's painting into the high points. So essentially you have two different ways of controlling where this brush will go, with the slider or with the curve, or even with a combination of the two. I personally prefer using the curve. The curve can be a little weird when you first look at it if you're not accustomed to using curves to edit images in Photoshop, for example. But if you just remember, it just represents the fall off of your brush and how it's being impacted by the highs and lows of the form of the surface. It's pretty easy to understand. So once again, I'm going to flip this vertically, bring this down. Actually, let's reset it entirely. Let's flip it horizontally, flip it vertically. Let's bring this up here, bring this down, and then let this be a nice curve like this. And then we'll find another area that we can paint on like this. There we go. So you see if I turn up the slider, it's going to paint into the recess. Turn down the slider, it's going to paint in the high points. So those two can be used in conjunction to one another. The default setting, of course, would be 0. That's right in the middle. And then your curve is going to have more of an impact. So let's bring this back up. There we go. Set that to 0. We should actually barely be able to see anything happening here. Yeah. The effect is very, very slight, if anything. And then as we turn this down, it starts to actually impact the surface more and more. If I turn this all the way down, there you can see what we get. Now, if I go to my brush menu and go to Load Brush, I have another custom brush I'd like to show you. This is called Crack Paint Brush, Crack Edge Paint. Now what this does, if you see I've got the curve over on the far right-hand side here, this only paints on the edges of the cracks, and it can be a little hard to see. There we go. Let's turn our brush size up. We might actually need to turn up our intensity on that. There we go. This is only going to paint on the very, very edges of my surface there. Let's turn this up a little bit. There you go. Let's bring this down a little bit more. I think that was set to 2. There we go. If I get right down in that recess, you see it's only grabbing the edges. It's going to be much easier to see on something like a fissure or a crack in the skull over here. There we go. So anywhere you've got a very defined edge or plane change, this is only going to paint on the very, very edges of that. So again, this is a great way that you can go in and detail your surfaces in a very specific way by targeting your brush with custom brush settings. So let's take a look at another customization tool that we can use. I'm going to go to the light box and just open up Tool Polysphere. Let's go back to the color white, and we'll go back to our standard brush. Now, if I have a standard brush and make sure that RGB is turned off and Z-add is turned on, and then I draw a stroke along the surface, let's reset everything. Incidentally, if you have customized your brushes and you want an easy way to reset them, go to the bottom of your brush menu here, and there is a Reset Current Brush, and reset all brushes. So I'm going to reset my current brush, and now the standard brush is back to its standard settings. That's my standard brush with its normal behavior. We can add gravity to brushes. So if I go to the depth control here, there is a gravity arrow. Whatever direction I point this arrow is the direction that gravity is going to act on the surface. So if I turn it sideways, it'll be more like wind. If I turn it straight down, it will be gravity. So we'll turn this all the way up so you can really see it. You see that sort of tugs those faces down as I sculpt. So it's actually a really nice way to create wrinkles and folds and drapery, is to use this gravity modifier on a custom brush. So I could take something like this, maybe even apply a very, very simple alpha 1 to it. And this is really good for creating like folds of skin or gills or folds in cloaks or clothing of any type, really. So use this in conjunction with your other brushes like the Damn Standard brush, and you can get some really nice drapery effects. And that, again, that gravity slider can be changed directionally. If I turn this sideways and then sculpt with the same brush, it starts to push things to the right. If I turn it the other way, it will push things to the left. So this is a really great tool to be aware of that you have here that you can use. If I change my brush, it's going to stay just on the brush that I set it up on. Some of these other settings don't do that though. For example, mask by polygroups under auto masking. This is going to be on for every brush. So if I turn on mask by polygroups and then change to a different brush, you see that it stays on no matter what brush I have selected. So be aware of that, because it still happens to me. I'll forget that I have mask by polygroups turned on, and then I'm unable to sculpt on something and I can't quite remember why, and it takes me a moment to remember. I'll show you this in action. If we go to something that has polygroups, for example, the Nick Z average male, we'll close the light box. If we go to frame mode, you can see this character has various polygroups here. I'm going to go to the layers menu. And let's just bake all these layers. Those are 3D sculpting and painting layers. We have a whole chapter on that. If you have not seen that chapter, if you're watching out of order, for example, fear not, we do talk about those later. I just want to get the polygroups themselves. So if I have a mesh like this that has polygroups on it, meaning that certain faces have a color code assigned to them, so I can easily Control-Shift-Click on them to hide and show different face groups. If I use the standard brush and my mask by polygroups is turned on and I click on a polygroup and start sculpting, it's only going to affect the polygroup that I click on. If I take the move brush, for example, and then click and drag on a polygroup, it's only going to move the faces of the first polygroup that I touch. Now I can dial this down and get a little bit of play with it. You see it's not affecting the other groups quite as much as the first group. And if I turn it to 0, then of course that's the default behavior and it affects everybody. If I turn it to 50, that's about half and half, as you would imagine. So that's actually a great utility mask, and it can be really useful to have a custom move brush, for example, that's masked by polygroups. Speaking of, there is another custom brush called Move Topological, and that is just a customized move brush. If I go to B for brush, M for move, and then select T for topology, I get Move Topological. Now what this does is the standard move brush will grab anything that's underneath the red circle. It doesn't care. If it's under the red circle, it's going to grab that geometry and try and move it. So if I'm trying to separate the lips, that's going to be a challenge. But if I go to B for brush, M for move, T for topology, this is just going to move those faces which are topologically close to one another. So it's having much less of an effect on the upper lip and the lower lip, depending on which one I'm clicking on. Now I can change the range of that effect. If it's still too strong and it's grabbing both lips, come down here to your auto masking. Go to, let me close out of this curve right there by clicking the close button. If I go to topological, which is turned on, and set my range to maybe 0.5, the range is nowhere near as strong now, so it will only grab that upper lip. I was using this the other day to sculpt some blend shapes on a character, some facial expressions, and it was really good for isolating the lips from the upper lip and lower lip and isolating the gums from the lips. And I was also using the mask my polygroups quite a bit as well, because I wanted to make sure that when I was sculpting, say I was sculpting an eye close, if I take the mask by polygroups and turn it all the way up, then I can have a pretty big brush size here, and I don't have to worry about grabbing the eyebrow, which shouldn't be moving while the character is blinking. So this is a really handy combination of customized auto masking that you can use to get the best possible result. So let's say that you have customized a brush. Let's say, for example, you have a clay tubes brush, and that clay tubes brush, you have turned the alpha off. And let's say you have also gone to the stroke menu, and you've gone to lazy mouse, and you've turned on lazy mouse, and that adds just a delay on the brush. It gives you this nice sort of red line there that gives a delay and makes it easier to make a smooth sweeping stroke. So let's say that you really like this brush and you want to keep it and you want to have it available at other times that you're in ZBrush. Well, it's very, very simple to do that. Just go to the tool menu, grab a polysphere, turn off frame mode, and let's center it on screen. We're just going to make a couple strokes on this so we can make a custom icon for our new brush. So I'm going to put a couple strokes on here. Just do a few on the surface. Now, if I go to the brush menu, we have an icon here under brush that says select icon. And the typeface is a little weird. You might look at that and think it says selection. It's select icon. And that will browse to a browser window where you can browse to a PSD file to use for your brush icon. So if I were to just save out an image like this of my document, watch what happens. Go to document, export. Remember, we export images from ZBrush by using the document export. And I'm just going to call this test brush. Gives me a preview, and I can crop here if I want to. I can crop the width like so, crop the height. I can, there we go, change my opacity if I want to. We can crop the top and crop the left, and then click OK. Now, for this brush, if I go to select icon, and I'm just going to save out, or excuse me, grab that image that I just saved out, right there, test brush. There you see it's loaded that image into the preview icon. Now, if I don't crop my image, if I go to document, export, and just export this either as a PSD or a JPEG. Let's do it as a PSD this time. And I'll just do it as ZBrush document. Then, if I go to select icon and grab ZBrush document, you see what happens is it's pushed it away. It's zoomed out smaller because it's trying to get that entire document window in there as an icon. So the problem is you're not really able to get a perfect square without making your document a perfect square. So this is the trick to making the perfect brush icon. Go to document, turn off proportions, and we'll just set the width and height to, let's just do 1080 by 1080. It's a bit large, but it's 2020. There's plenty of storage space. Click resize. It's going to tell you that it's not undoable. That's fine. It will drop whatever's on canvas, whatever's on screen to the canvas. So you'll have to press Control-N to clear your canvas. And then if I click actual or AA half, it will give me the document. You can't really see it right now, but if we go to document, you can see that we are 1080 by 180. That was I thought that looked a bit strange. Let's set that to 1080 again. It's like, that doesn't seem right. Resize. So it's 1080 by 10. It's not catching that extra 0. 1080. There we go. Resize. Say yes. There we go. Now I've got my square. Zoom out. Draw my sphere. Go into edit mode. And then I'll just position it on screen and press F for focus. So it's filling my square. Now I will go to select icon, or excuse me, go to document, go to export. We'll export that ZBrush document. We can export it as a JPEG. And I'm going to turn my crop down, get rid of that crop entirely. There we go. Click OK. And then we'll go to select icon and we will browse to that JPEG that we just saved out. And there you go. Now we've got the perfect brush icon. So it's a little trick. It's a little hint at how you can make perfect icons, so when you have a library of your own brushes, it's very, very easy for you to find them. So now that we have these brushes, what do we do with them? You don't want to lose them. You don't want to have to reset up these brushes every time you start ZBrush. So the way you build your own brush library is go to the brush menu, and anything that you've changed here in this brush menu is going to save with this brush. If you adjust the alpha, let's say, for example, and we talk about alphas in more depth in the alpha chapter, but let's say I have applied an alpha to this brush, like alpha, let's do something directional, like the star or the arrow alpha. And let's say that I go to the modify menu here. So we're on the brush menu now. I'm going to go to the alpha menu, and I'm going to go to modify. And let's say I tile this brush 3 times. So now I get 3 of those arrows, which is a really nice way to make kind of a little rake, like a rake brush, something like this. You can make a brush to sculpt the beginnings of hair. It's very similar to the weave brush, really. So I can build up a brush like this. You remember I said that there's things that you can change under the stroke menu. If I go to the stroke menu here and I go to modifiers, and let's say I turn on roll. If I turn on roll, it's going to roll instances of my alpha along my stroke. So look what that does. It creates this directional stroke where each instance of the alpha is drawn out once before the next one is applied. So there's a lot of great opportunities to use something like this if you've got a tileable alpha that you want to apply to a surface in a single stroke. So if I set that setting there, and let's say we go to the stroke menu again, and we could turn on no back and forth. And what this will do is, as we are drawing our stroke, it keeps you from backtracking across it. So it's only going to make the stroke go in one direction. And this can be really nice when you're doing hard surface, where you're trying to get a very organized, ordered looking, radiating pattern. This can be really handy for that. Or if you're sculpting something like leather wraps on an arm, I find this really handy. Turning on no back and forth. So essentially, to repeat that, what it's doing, if you go to stroke, modifiers, and turn on no back and forth, it's allowing you to stroke in one direction. And then if I backtrack, it's not going to draw the stroke until I go back in the same direction. Were I to turn that off, if I go to stroke and turn off no back and forth and I draw the stroke, I can then backtrack across it. So it kind of makes things a little bit messy, which sometimes might be what you want. So now that we've customized this brush, I'm going to go to my alpha menu. Now, in the alpha menu, if you go to transfer, you can click make modified alpha, and that will bake down the settings that we changed in the alpha. If you were to not modify that alpha, if you were not to bake that down, if we go back to our original alpha here, let's go back and select that again. There we go. So if I have this alpha selected, this is the arrow alpha that is basically running through a modifier stack here in the alpha menu. If I bake it down by make modified alpha, this is a new alpha with it's no longer passing through these modifiers. So I can save this alpha with my brush, or if I have my standard brush like this, the alpha that is being run through the modifiers. And then if I go to the brush menu, so don't be confused. This is the alpha menu that we're on to adjust the alpha settings. And I'm just opening that up from the top of the screen. And then the brush menu is over here, docked on the side. If I go to the brush menu and go to save as, it asks me where I want to save this brush. So if I just save this as test brush, click save, it saves it. But it's saving this alpha that's being modified. It's not saving an actual modified alpha. So if you want to save a modified alpha with your brush, make sure you go to the alpha menu, click make modified alpha, and that's going to bake that down. And then make sure that that alpha is selected and go to brush, save as. Let me bring this window over here, and then you can save that brush with that modified alpha baked in. Now, don't forget, if you have tiled your alphas, you want to go back and change that, because look what happens. Every time I select a different alpha, they're all being fed through this modifier stack. Think of this like a mixer or a soundboard, and your alpha plugs into this, and whatever you change here, it will change every alpha. So now we've seen how we save a brush with a modified alpha, how we create a custom brush icon. Now, how do we create our own library that we can constantly get back to? We do that by going to Brush, Save As, and this time I'm going to go to my Applications ZBrush 2021 folder. So I'll pull this window over to the other screen so you can see it. Here we go, and we'll go to ZBrush 2021. And then I will organize by type here. And this is the same for Windows or Mac. You see that we've got our folders laid out now based on the type, or our icons laid out based on type. So the folders are up here at the very, very top. So I go to ZBrushes, and here I have all these different folders. This folder represents the Lightbox. So anything that I put in here will load up in the Lightbox every time I load the Lightbox. So let's say, for example, I want to create a custom brush folder, and I'll just call it Matty Monster. And I'm going to save my crack paintbrush in there. Click Save, and there we go. Now, if I go to the Lightbox and go to the Brush menu, I will have these in alphabetical order now, and there's Matty Monster. Open that up, and there is my first custom brush. So I think it's good to create your own folder for your own custom brushes so they don't get mixed in with the standard ZBrush brushes. I also think it's good to put them in the Lightbox instead of putting them into the root brush folder. The root brush folder are the brushes that are loaded up with ZBrush when ZBrush loads, these brushes here. Now there's two reasons why I wouldn't change this. The first one is it's going to change the hotkeys, and it's going to change the placement of these brushes when you're pressing the B for brush menu hotkey, which, depending on how accustomed to the layout you are, it may or may not be a big problem. Also, all these brushes load up with ZBrush, and the bigger this menu gets, and it's already quite big, ZBrush can handle it fine. It's just if you overload it, you're going to start running into a situation where it's filling your entire screen and it's hard to navigate. Usually, brushes that I don't use every single day, and no custom brush that I make would I find myself using every single day. Perhaps I would edit an existing brush here. Like, I very rarely use the alpha on the Clay Tubes brush. So I might turn the Clay Tubes alpha off and then save the Clay Tubes brush on top of itself without that alpha, for example. But I encourage you to be very cautious when you change that folder, and I will show you how to do it. If you go to the brush menu and go to Save As, this time, instead of saving into the ZBrushes folder, we are going to go to ZData, and there's brush presets. These are the preset brushes that load with ZBrush every time you start the program. So again, I would be careful about changing these, but if you do have a custom brush that you do use constantly, you can load it in here. So that is an option. You may also realize that the Lightbox doesn't easily allow you to access other locations on your computer. This is something that I have done before in the Alphas folder. When I go to the Lightbox and I go to Alphas, let's take a look at that. The Alpha folders, or the Alpha folder has this selection of custom or standard alphas that come with ZBrush. And here you see I've got MM alphas. That's Matty Monster alphas. This is a shortcut. You see, this is actually going to another location. So I can put my own brushes in here. And all you need to do that is to go to your applications folder. So I'm just going to go over to my Finder here really quick. And I will go to my applications folder. And I'll go to ZBrush 2021 and drag it over onto the screen. I'm going to have to leave full screen mode. So once again, we will go to ZBrushes. And if I were to put a shortcut in here to any other location, say for example, I wanted to go to my custom brush folder that I have on a completely different hard drive, I will go to my, what I call my working drive on my other screen, and go into my backup folder and my Gnomon classes folder. And I have a folder in here, which I'll pull over and show to you. Custom brushes and palettes, ZBrush, and Matty Monster. So these are some of my custom brushes. So if I were to right click on this and make alias, this makes a shortcut. So I can take this alias now and I can drop this alias into this folder. So there's the Matty Monster alias. So watch what happens now if I go to Lightbox, go to brushes, there's Matty Monster alias, double click that, and that takes me to the folder that is on the other volume. So it's a completely different hard drive than my ZBrush install folder. So that's something that you might find really handy to do. Instead of putting all of your custom materials on the ZBrush install drive, which is typically your C drive or your home drive, that can eat up a lot of space. And especially with my alpha libraries and my brush libraries, they can get pretty big. And my models that I like to use, I don't want that all sitting on the same drive that ZBrush is running off of. So it's best for me to put shortcuts in there so I can go access those areas anytime that I actually need them. So we've looked at how to customize brushes using auto masking inside of ZBrush, using things like the mask by polygroups and mask by cavity. We have also seen how we can use some of the settings that are under the stroke menu to add custom behaviors to the brushes. Anything you change in a brush in ZBrush, you can save it. Now, if you save it, for example, with the same name, standard brush, it's going to sort of hijack your standard brush for that whole session of ZBrush. One thing that you can do here is if you go to a brush, let's say we clone this brush. So maybe I want to take my standard brush and customize the standard brush, but I don't want to lose my standard brush for this ZBrush session. If I clone it, I've now made a copy of the standard brush. See, we've got standard 1 and we've got standard right here. So I'll go to standard 1 and then I will customize that brush. So there's nothing kind of more annoying than going through a big process of customizing a brush and then realizing that you have basically, for that one session of running ZBrush, you've overwritten your standard brush. It can be a little annoying. Then you have to save your custom brush out, reset all your brushes, and load it back in. So it's a good sort of working practice to clone your brushes before you go in and start customizing them. Now, there's a lot of other different types of brush customizations that we can do that we have entire chapters devoted to. For example, you can create custom alphas using 3D meshes. We can also create what are called insert multi-mesh brushes, which insert geometry as a brush, and that geometry can be dynameshed together, or we can use it for booleans, or we can just use it to assemble hard surface projects on their own. What I wanted to do in this chapter was give you the tools to understand how to go about changing your brushes, the main menus where you'll find the settings that you can change and get you started on how to take advantage of this power of ZBrush. The brush menu is very, very deep. There is a lot that happens in here. In the brush menu, we have the ability to create brushes with creating insert mesh brushes and nano mesh brushes, which we talk about in their own chapters. We have the curve controls here. The curve control is a very simple looking menu, but this is really, really useful for the move brush especially. If I have the move brush, it pulls things out in sort of a rounded point like this. Now, when we were on Pacific Rim 2, we used this brush a lot because if you turn on accurate curve mode, it pulls it out to much more of a point. So when you're trying to create little spines along a figure, it's really nice to use accurate curve mode. It just forces ZBrush to follow the curve, the edit curve for the brush here. Before we had the clay tubes brush, I used to take the inflate brush. I used to turn my focal shift up And watch what happens in that curve. See how that focal shift affects that curve? So what I would do is I would go up here and I would create a nice flat kind of brush like this. And then I would turn my Z intensity down. And then when I was sculpting skin or sort of cellulite or a fatty tissue, I would use this brush in kind of a circular pattern. And this is very similar to what we ended up getting with the clay tubes brush in terms of a nice sort of noisy surface. Every once in a while, I will still use this technique because the clay tubes brush, as you've probably already seen, if I go to B for brush, C for clay tubes, it's very aggressive. That is a very aggressive brush setting there. The inflate brush, on the other hand, with that customization setting, gives me this nice sort of flattened fall off. Moving on from that, we have the depth control, where we've seen what this does, and this has some other tools that we use in hard surface. The depth control itself is used primarily with the planer brush, but you can use it with any brush technically. So if I had a dam standard brush like this, and I'm just going to make sure that Z add or Z sub is turned on, I'm going to go to my auto masking, and mask by polygroups is turned on. I thought that was behaving strangely. I told you that that will happen. It's very easy to forget you have that turned on. So I'm going to turn that back down to 0. Then I will use the dam standard brush, like so. If I were to change the embed control on this brush, I can change the depth at which it actually impacts the surface. And I can turn on a depth mask as well, which for the purposes of this brush, pretty much renders it useless. If I were using the planer brush, however, a brush that's flattening a surface down, I can change the depth at which that brush will impact the surface. You see, I just pushed that brush deeper into the surface because the planer brush works by flattening everything to its own plane. If I take this, you see we've got these little floating islands here. If I take the depth and set my embed to 0, it will flatten everything to the first layer that I touch. So if I click that, it's going to flatten everything down to that point. Let's go ahead and bring it down just a little bit, turn our brush size up, and there we go. We can get rid of those little towers that we don't want. We've already seen gravity. There's, like I said, a lot of depth into this menu. You can adjust your samples. The clay tubes brush has a variant on it. If I go to B for brush, C for clay, there is a clay buildup brush. Now the clay buildup brush is the clay tubes brush, but it has buildup mode turned on. Now this makes your brush super aggressive. Look how that builds out so quickly. Every time I draw a brush stroke using the buildup mode, it's going to keep building up on that surface. So I find this to be more aggressive than my style of sculpting. So I don't typically use build-up mode, but I thought it would be good for you to know it's there because it can be really useful when you're blocking in shapes for hard surface. In the hard surface chapters, we do talk about using organic shapes to sort of block it and start what will eventually be a hard surface model. And using build-up mode can be really handy for that because it can help you build up volumes very, very quickly. So experiment with these and see if there is something that you like in them. And if there is, then you should feel free to use them. So I'm going to go back to my regular clay tubes brush. Elasticity controls the sort of elasticity of the material when you're moving an object around with the brushes. It's most commonly seen on the move brush. We have controls for fiber mesh, for our fiber mesh groom brushes. In the fiber mesh chapter, I showed you how to use preserve length to make pretty much any brush into a grooming brush. So that's important to know that these settings are there. There's also a twist on here. We can twist along with our stroke. So let's go to a standard brush. Draw my stroke. Let's turn up our Z intensity. And I'm going to go back to the beginnings of this sphere where it's no longer all deformed and in a weird position. And I'm going to enlarge my document window again by going to document, and under document I'm going to set my width to 1920 and my height to 1080. 1920 by 1080, resize, say yes, Control N, declare the canvas, draw the model again, and then F for focus after you go into edit mode. So if I were to start drawing with the standard brush, you'll notice that if I go to my depth control, I still have gravity turned on. So let's turn that off. So you have to be careful when you are customizing your brushes that you don't forget you have things that are persistent turned on. Things that are persistent, I mean things that affect all of your brushes, like the mask by polygroups and things like that will often be a global setting, not a brush specific setting. So just be aware of that, because like I said, I have been using ZBrush a long time, and to this day it catches me out where it's like, why is my brush behaving weird? And then I remember I turned on some auto masking and forgotten about it. So this is the standard brush being used in the standard fashion. If I were to turn on twist rate, it will twist. Now that's really strong, so let's bring this back to like 0.4. So this can be really good for building folds. You got to be careful with it, and oftentimes it really behaves best if you've got a fair bit of geometry to work with. So there you go. That's trying to sort of twist that shape. You can see how you might use this to create the bell in a toadstool, for example, or maybe folds in clothing. It's whatever you can come up with. Your imagination is really the only limit on this. And remember also, you can combine these together with other brushes. So I've got the Z sub, and I've got my depth mask turned on. So once again, you got to be careful about this stuff. Now that brush will actually affect the surface. With depth masking on, it was still affecting the surface. It was just sitting inside of the surface, so there was nothing for it to touch. Because the flatten brush will flatten everything down to its level, that's why it works particularly well with the cavity the depth masking, because if it's sitting inside the model, it's going to flatten everything that's behind it against the plane where that brush is sitting. So there's other settings like orientation and surface, the modifiers here. This is all mainly about tracks and trails and repeating alphas along a stroke. Most of these, you're going to have the most success learning it by sitting down and tinkering with some brushes and trying to make your own. For example, if I were on the standard brush and I once again had a directional alpha like the arrow. So some of these, it's easier to show than it ever would be to explain or to read in a software manual. So if I divide the sphere a couple times and use that stroke, I get this. You see I've got that nice twist on there, and that actually is quite a cool surface texture there. If I were to turn down my Z intensity, I could use something like this just as a bit of costume detailing. It looks like armor. Let's turn that Z intensity back up. There we go. Let's go to twist and make sure our twist is turned off. Now down here, I can smooth my brush stroke as I'm stroking along. So that's different than lazy mouse, which smooths out the movement in your stroke. If I turn smooth up, what this is going to do, it's going to smooth the geometry as I sculpt it. You see that? So that's really nice if you've got maybe noise in your alpha, or your brush is just, it's not quite treating the surface the way you want. You can turn that smooth up. It will slow your brush stroke down, but it does give you a really nice effect that I encourage you to experiment with, because I do use that setting, but it's on a case-by-case basis whenever I find that I need to. So I'm going to make sure I turn that back down. You can multiply your strength, so you can turn up a strength modifier. So let's say, for example, I'm on the smooth brush. Press Shift. Notice these things change when I press Shift. That's because when I'm pressing the Shift key, I'm invoking the smooth brush, and the smooth brush can have its own settings. So if I press the smooth brush, and let's say I take my strength, well, let's turn smooth all the way up to 100, and I try and smooth, and that's what I get. If I turn strength modifier all the way up, it's going to make that smooth brush stronger. It might be a little bit difficult to see it, but it is there. There we go. You can see it much easier now. It's a much, much stronger and more aggressive smooth brush just because we've got that strength modifier turned up on there. Now, the brush modifier slider here you would use with some regularity if you take to it, if you like it. That is different depending on the brush you have selected. There isn't a standard behavior for that brush. So for example, if I were to let's say have the smooth brush. Let's go to a surface that's got a lot of details. Smooth brush is a really great way to demonstrate this. I'm going to take the standard brush and I'm going to change to the dot alpha and the spray stroke, and let's just spray some bumps all over the surface. Oops, not that big and not that strong. I'm going to go to brush and I'm going to reset all of my brushes because all that tinkering with settings has made things start to behave a little funny. So reset all brushes, standard brush, spray stroke, and dot alpha, and there we go. So I'm just creating some surface noise there. Now if I hold down the shift key, that gives me the smooth brush, and it smooths everything equally. If I hold down the shift key and go to brush modifier, the brush modifier for the smooth brush will isolate where the smooth takes effect. So if I set this down to -0, it will keep the low points of my model, and it will only smooth the high points like this. See, it's preserving the recesses and making that really creepy brain-like texture there. If I undo that and reverse that, turn it up to +100 and then start to smooth, it smooths only into the recesses. So that's a really useful tool. That's the brush modifier slider. And again, that is going to behave differently depending on what brush you have selected. And I don't know that it's actually all documented what every single brush does with the brush modifier. So anytime you start to explore a new brush, I encourage you to have a look at that, that effect. Turn on the brush modifier and see what it does for your particular brush. So moving on, we close out of modifiers here. Sculptris Pro is going to allow us to control the Sculptris Pro settings. This is all just stuff that is specific to Sculptris Pro. Now, we skipped over surface. We're going to come back to that. Auto masking you've already seen. And then tablet pressure allows you to control tablet pressure settings if you want to further sort of tweak that from within ZBrush rather than in your tablet software driver interface. And lastly, we've got things like alpha and texture. So here you can see that we can change our what's called an aperture. And we can change our tiling. So this is kind of similar to what we were doing with the modified alpha mixer when we were changing the brush alphas on our alpha menu. So if I went to the alpha menu here, and remember we tiled the alpha. So let's say I've got the star alpha selected, and I go to a dot stroke or a freehand stroke, and I'm going to go back to a smooth sphere. Divide a couple times, and then draw like this. That's what I get. If I go here and under the brush menu and turn up alpha tile to 10, it's going to tile that alpha based on my stroke. Now, if I try and save a custom brush with this, if I go to brush, save as, watch what happens. Let's change to, actually I'm going to save that with a different name. I'm going to go to brush, save as, and we'll save this as standard. There we go. And I'm going to go to brush, reset all brushes. And I'm going to go to brush. So I'll load up my standard alt brush, and then it's stored that alpha and that modifier with that. So just be aware that those will save with your brush if you change the settings down here. So let's go back for our last thing that we want to look at, and that was the surfacing menu I mentioned. So if I take the standard brush and I draw the star alpha, make sure that I go ahead and let's reset this brush, reset current brush. It's not taking, so I'm just going to go to my alpha settings, make sure that I don't have tiling turned on the alpha, and I don't, so I'll just go back to my alphas and texture, and I'll just have to manually turn that down. There we go. So my default stroke looks something like this. If I go to surface and click noise, we can load the noise maker. Now the noise maker allows you to introduce procedural noise and texture inside of ZBrush. It's a very neat tool. I use it a lot. We have a whole chapter that talks just about this. But it also is found here under the brush menu. And why it's here is so you can add noise to your brush. So if I were to turn this brush noise up like this, click OK. Now when I sculpt with this brush, it's going to add the alpha plus my noise settings that I set up inside of Noisemaker. So this is really great when you're trying to create maybe poor texture. So let's say, for example, I have the broken up dot pattern for my alpha. And I still have that noise turned on. And let's go to the spray stroke. Clear the mask. And now we lay out this poor texture. If we zoom in, you see it's got a really nice rough kind of texture to it because it's applying that noise on top. So that's pretty handy. Otherwise, you're going to have to generate alphas from the Noisemaker that you find under the tool menu. And that's not ideal. This way you can actually change your noise settings directly on your brushes and then save it as it is. You don't have to save an alpha to represent that noise. Every time you load that noise back up, that noise setting under surface will be there. It saves with your brush. So I hope you found this chapter helpful and it's cleared up for you how you can further customize your brush selections and your tools that you use every day inside of ZBrush. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.